this is always the easiest way to do so. With all that being said though, we'll jump into the driving analyzer and get started. So here we are in the driving analyzer, and as we start the lap, we're going to let the car gradually track up to the outside wall on the entry into turn 1. Using these lines on the circuit as a bit of a reference, we can also utilize this safer barrier on the right hand side when it moves to the concrete as a reference too. So essentially this second to last white line on the circuit is going to be our initial reference in terms of turning in. Then we'll start braking just before this secondary line on the track here. Very, very gradually building up to our brake pressure though. Obviously we're turning in the beginning of the braking zone here, and we're also going to be coming off the banking onto the road course itself. So we do have to keep in mind that that change in balance of the car is going to make things a little bit more tricky, and potentially even lock an inside front as well. So it's something to keep in mind. We'll see that in a little bit. So we can see we're gradually building up to our first initial pressure, roughly 65%. We're maintaining that a little bit more constant, and then gradually increase after that once we get on this flat up to roughly 70%. From here though, we're trying to keep the car nice and straight, brake as long as we can, trailing the brake out nice and gently. Down to our second gear though, in terms of this mid-entry here, essentially when we get to this kind of access road on the left hand side between this grass, that's when we want to be just to the right of mid-track, and then we'll start our second turn-in phase. At this point though, we're down to our lower percentage to help keep a little bit of weight on the front end of the car to help it rotate in the mid-corner. Allows us to be a little bit more aggressive on the throttle and the corner exit, but we're also doing so in conjunction with increasing the steering lock for the turn itself. Using the inside tire wall as a reference here of where we want to position the car. So essentially we're trying to get as close as we can to this inside wall and picking up the throttle just a fraction after, essentially trying to borderline end up in the grass here, but we don't want to be in the grass, but we do want to be as close as we can to it without dipping a tire into that. Super aggressive on the initial throttle up to roughly 60%, then from there super gentle as we start to straighten out the car. Using up all this track on exit, just touching the outside curb, pulling the car back to the right again through this little dog leg, back to the left, then continuing to pull the car to the left to utilize this slight little bit of pit exit to help open up the entry into turn 3 here. In terms of our brake marker, we're going to use this 100 board on the right hand side here as it goes past, up to roughly 70% as our initial pressure, keeping the car nice and straight for as long as we can, then beginning to trail out as we turn in nice and early. Very, very gradual on the brake release though, trying to maintain the balance of the rear of the car. The car is quite trimmed out for this circuit, obviously being Daytona. We don't have much downforce, so at low speed, the rear of the car doesn't tend to have too much grip. So here, that's something to keep in mind, that we are trying to be super gentle on the brake release, just to make sure that we're managing the balance of the car as best as we can, taking the weight off the front of the car nice and gently. So down to our low percentage here, essentially trying to get to this inside curb right at the beginning, and then end up a little bit tighter in the mid corner, dipping our right side tires just on this secondary curb on the inside. Picking up the throttle super aggressive initially, more or less once the car lines up with this last white wall on the outside of the track. But then from there, very, very gentle on throttle and exit, trying to maximize that traction. It's very, very easy to break traction on the exit of this corner. The rear tires have already gone through a lot. Turn 1, they're already quite hot. So it's something that's very, very important to note, that it is very, very easy to break traction on exit here. So always be super gentle on that second application phase of the throttle on the exit of turn 3 here. Obviously using up all of the track on exit though, utilizing the track all the way out to this outside curb, essentially all fours outside this wide line, all the way to this curb. This is perfectly clean. There's no off track here. We can end up out to this outside curb right at the beginning. As we run down towards turn 4 now, obviously we're just going to gradually bring the car over to the right hand side of the circuit. This is a nice flat out corner on the entry. We'll turn in basically at this change in the white line on the right. We can see the white line kind of goes from straight to curving to the right. So this is going to be our turning point. Trying to just dip a couple tires on this inside curb here to keep the car a little bit tighter on the mid to exit. Mid track here for the braking zone into turn 5. Essentially starting to brake right at the start of this access road on the left hand side here, up to a peak pressure of roughly 65%, keeping the car nice and straight at this point. We can see we're trying to turn the wheel as little as possible while we're maintaining this peak pressure, letting the car track just to the left of mid-track as we then start to trail off the brake and gradually begin to turn the wheel in a little bit further. Down to our low percentage, trying to just touch this inside curb on the initial entry, but primarily we're going to drive the car in a little bit deeper, miss the inside curb, just a tiny little bit in the mid corner just after we pick up the throttle, up to roughly 65% initially. So again, super aggressive on the initial throttle, then very gentle. But on the exit, we want to try and pull the car back to the inside curb as close as we can, just to try and straighten up the exit a little bit. Here, we missed that a tiny little bit, but usually you tend to want to be as close as you can to this inside curb on the exit to help straighten the car up, help maximize drive on the corner exit here. It's very easy to break traction again on the exit of this corner, so something to keep in mind. In terms of the exit, obviously tracking the car out as wide as we can before then pulling the car back to the right nice and gently before turn 6. We've got plenty of time between these two turns, so we don't have to do so super aggressively. In terms of our brake marker here for turn 6, so this is the run onto the banking. Obviously, we want to try and maximize our run out of this corner as best as we can, essentially starting to brake at the middle of this access road here, more or less at the 100 board, building up the pressure nice and gently. It's roughly 70% using this outside curb on the entry as a reference. Starting to turn in basically at the end of this outside curb on the turn in. Very gentle down to our low percentage. Again, trying to keep a little bit of weight over the front axle to help the car rotate in the mid corner. It's allowing us to get on the throttle a little bit more aggressive earlier. Obviously then we're super gentle on the throttle to maximize the traction on the exit. But the better run we can get onto this front straight, obviously the better, or onto this banking, sorry, obviously the better, of course, considering this is more or less the longest flat section of the circuit, and it's a prime passing opportunity, and there's a lot of time to be had here. So obviously we're trying to maximize the run onto here as best as we can, using as much of this inside curb as possible. Taking it quite late though, ultimately we want to make sure that we're on this inside curb all the way until the end of it on the inside. Aggressive initially up to roughly 50%, but then from 50 to 100 is super progressive as we're straightening out the wheel. We're trying to really maximize the traction out of here. You can even see that the TC is triggering quite a lot here. We can see that by these LEDs, these vertical LEDs here. We can see that we are triggering the traction control even when we're going super gentle on the throttle here. So traction out of this corner is really tricky to find. So that's why we're trying to do so super gently. We can see here too that we do have a slight little bit of oversteer. So that's even a sign that I could have been even more gentle on the throttle. So it's something to keep in mind. In terms of the exit though, mid-track, you can kind of approach this a couple different ways. You can take a tighter exit, you can take a wider exit. Usually for me though, I tend to prefer the mid-track route. Obviously the tighter line will gain you a little bit more time in the short term, lose you a little bit on the banking, and the wider line the opposite. But usually, obviously the wider you go though, you do lose time through this turn itself. So for me, I usually find mid-track tends to give the best of both worlds in terms of overall lap time. Running nice and close to this this white line on the bottom, kind of as it meets the apron as we come up onto the banking. Now, the important thing with the banking here is to try and pull the car down to this yellow line on the bottom of the circuit and ultimately keep it there. You want to try and travel as shortest distance as possible at all times on this banking, especially if you're on a lap. Obviously, if you're passing someone, it's a completely different story, but on a hot lap like this, we're trying to stay as close as we can to the yellow line on the bottom. Even as we exit oval 2, we will stay low just for a little bit longer before we then pull the car up to the top of the circuit on the right hand side as we prepare ourselves for the bus stop. Now obviously, because the car is so trimmed out aero wise, this is a very tricky corner on the circuit. Ultimately, keeping the rear end in check on entry is very challenging, and that's why you'll see in the bottom right that we are trailing out of the brakes so gentle. The progressiveness out of the brake is the key in terms of keeping the rear end in check with it trimmed out so much. So this is something to obviously always keep in mind whenever the car is super loose, even if it's a car like the Audi GT3, for example, that is usually always very knife edge to drive and very oversteery. The gentle release out of the brake is the key in terms of keeping that balance. So in terms of our brake marker on the entry to the bus stop here, just after the 2 board, so more or less in between the 2 and this yellow light on the outside here, up to our peak pressure of roughly 70%, beginning to turn in just at the 1 board, very gentle out of the brake, 4th gear on this initial turn here, keeping it in 4th throughout the turn. So essentially we want to make sure that we're down to 4th just before we get to this first inside curb Using a little bit of the grass on the left here to try and help open up the rest of the bus stop. Ultimately, we want to try and maximize our run out of here as best as we can. So we're trying to use up a little bit of this grass on the inside to help open up the turn. We can see though that we are kind of treating this one braking zone, or these two corners, like one braking zone. So we can see here that we're gradually coming out of the brake, but we're not actually coming out of it all the way. We're only down to roughly 4% on this apex. Then as we straighten the car out a little bit in the change of direction, we can see we're braking a little bit harder again to try and wash off a little bit more speed. So we're not trying to do all of our braking into the first corner. We're trying to spread it out over these first two apexes to try and manage the front grip of the car a little bit better and carry a little bit more momentum into the chicane. Ultimately, that's the goal. So something to always keep in mind is that on this entry here, you kind of always want to try and treat these two corners like one braking zone. Again, gradually down to our low percentage after this second brake application, roughly 10% here, and again, using up a little bit of this grass in the mid corner, trying to ultimately keep the car as tight as we can in the middle of the bus stop here. Clearing out of the brake just after we come off that secondary inside curb. Aggressive initially on the throttle, up to roughly 73%. To try and get a reaction from the car, help it try and rotate in the mid corner. Then from there, as we can straighten out the car a little bit more after we get that rotation, then we're up to 100%. Using this inside curb right at the end, as much of it as we can, before then obviously letting the car track nice and wide on the exit. You can also dip a couple of tires in the grass on this last curb and get away with it. So obviously that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to make the track as wide as we can, and to do that sometimes it means using a little bit of grass. Obviously without any off tracks though, so this is perfectly legal, but we are trying to make the track as wide as we can. Then ultimately from here to the end of the lap, we're just trying to travel the shortest distance as we can. So like I said before, on the oval, we're trying to hug this yellow line for as long as we can, all the way through the turn. Focusing on the upshifts. Ultimately, we're already in 6th gear, but we are shifting at the last red light. Still staying nice and close to the yellow line, especially on the exit of 4. Trying to stay right on the bottom here. Obviously, we can't drop below the yellow line. That's illegal, but we can stay as close as we can to it. Then as we approach the tri-oval, to this last final sweeper, we're going to stay nice and close to the bottom before letting the car track up just before the finish line, just to kind of help set ourselves up for the start of the next lap when we obviously need to then be out to the outside wall. But with all that being said though, that brings to an end this week's virtual racing school video tutorial for the European Sprint Series in the Corvette C8R GTE from Daytona. As always, if you found this tutorial useful or helpful, be sure to use the send feedback button within the data pack page